Hello everyone! So as most of you probably know, I started doing these monthly roundup videos only very recently. I mean, the very first one I did was about a month or so ago for June. And even though I really liked how that video came out, turns out the style and approach that I did for that video didn't quite work because the amount of copyright claims I got from that video was ridiculous. So that's why I'm ditching the whole trailer footage aspect with my voice over the top, and I'm just going straight up me talking to a camera this time. So without any further ado, I've got my laptop here. Let's get straight into this. And the first film that I watched in July was Deepwater Horizon. And just to clarify, this has nothing to do with the fact of that whole Gulf of Mexico thing that was happening at the start of the month. Had nothing to do with that. I just wanted to watch Deepwater Horizon because I'd never seen it and I was curious. And I've got to say, I ended up loving this movie a lot more than I thought I would. I knew I'd kind of like the movie, but I genuinely kind of love this film. This is the most anxiety I've had watching a film in ages. Like, I know a lot of films can really go out of their way to try and make you feel suspenseful and make you feel tense. But this film did it and it just felt effortless. And yeah, I absolutely loved this film. And I knew the whole BP oil disaster thing was bad, but I didn't realise it was this bad. And part of that is probably to do with the fact that when the actual thing happened in real life, I was only 11, so I didn't quite understand the gravity of the situation. I didn't realise how bad it really was. But after seeing this film, I kind of get it. And that's one thing the film does really well. It does a brilliant job of really capturing the scale and severity of the entire situation and everything that happened. And it does a really good job of really putting you into that moment and really emphasising just how enormous this disaster was. Then I watched The Life Aquatic with Steve Zissou, which up to that point was the only Wes Anderson film I had never seen. I had literally seen everything else the guy had made except for this one. And I ended up really liking it. The first half of the film starts off a bit slow and it takes a while to kind of find its groove, but once it gets into a certain pattern and a certain rhythm, it genuinely did work. And I will admit that I do feel like the humour in this film works a lot better than some of Wes Anderson's other movies, especially like Darjeeling Limited and Bottle Rocket, which are movies of his that feel like they're trying to do humour in a specific way, but it just comes across as very stilted, whereas with The Life Aquatic, almost all the humour works. And part of that is down to the cast, which are just as good as usual. They're all brilliant in this film. And you can tell that this and The Royal Tenenbaums are the first times in Anderson's career that he's really starting to experiment and really fully utilise that ensemble cast that his films will inevitably become famous for. Then, for some random reason, I rewatched the Simpsons movie. It's been quite a while since I've seen the film, although I do have vivid memories of going to see it in the cinema as a kid. And I've got to say, even though I don't think it's as funny as the SpongeBob SquarePants movie, the original one, I still think this film holds up very well. It's paced very, very quickly. Like, the pacing in this film is very snappy and to the point, and it just tells you what you need to know and just shows you what you need to see really, really quickly. And the writing manages to keep up with it in a way that is very entertaining. I mean, there's not much else I can really say. It's got some really funny moments in it that still hold up after all these years. It's, like I said, it's very to the point, and I've got to say, that shot of Bart skateboarding, I still can't believe they got away with that. Then I switched things up a bit by watching A Field in England, directed by Ben Wheatley. I think the whole reason why I watched this film is because I'm really intrigued to see his new film In the Earth, which I still haven't had a chance to see yet. And I've heard a lot of people compare that film to A Field in England. So I gave this movie a watch, not quite knowing what to expect. And overall, I quite liked the film, but it did feel like it didn't quite know when to commit to certain things. Like, it would spend a scene or two committing so heavily to a specific visual idea, and it really does work for those specific scenes. But then after those scenes are finished, it then has a little moment of like, right, now I don't know what to do, and then it would commit to something else. And though those scenes where it does commit heavily to a single idea, those scenes do work really well. Like, when it goes full on into psychedelia, it is pretty damn impressive, especially considering what they did on a very, very small budget. Because that is one thing I've always admired about Ben Wheatley as a filmmaker. The stuff he is able to produce on such small budgets just really impresses me and inspires me as a filmmaker myself to try new things despite being limited in resources and money. And A Field in England is one of the better examples of that. After that, I then watched Steven Soderbergh's Contagion to make myself feel more like shit. And yeah, it's really good. I wouldn't put this up there with some of Steven Soderbergh's best films, like Ocean's 11, etc., but it is still a very well-made film. The pacing is typical of Soderbergh's films. It's very snappy, it's very stylish, but is nowhere near as in your face as the Ocean's films, which I'm kind of glad it's like that, because it is snappy enough to the point where it works for the sake of the film and it shows you what you need to see. But I feel like if the editing and all that was any snappier and any more stylish, it would just be a bit obnoxious. But luckily he knows when to do certain things with the camera and with the editing. I would have to say, though, the one thing that impressed me, well, I don't even know if I can say it impressed me, but the one thing that fascinated me the most about this film is just how scarily accurate everything is. And I know what you're going to say. It's a film about a pandemic. It's going to be somewhat reminiscent of what's happening now. I don't mean it like that. I mean, there are things in this film that are 100% exactly what has happened in the last year or so, like down to a T. And it is so scary, the fact that this film, the fact that it came out in 2011 and it got so much of it right. Now we're on to the first new release that I watched in July, which was Black Widow. And this is a bit of a weird one for me, because I can understand why some people really don't like it, but I can also understand why some people absolutely love it. The things that this movie gets right are really good. Stylistically, the film does not feel like any other regular MCU movie. It almost feels like you're watching a Bourne movie, just with MCU characters in it. Which, the fact that they went so hard on that, I really have to commend, because they really did a good job of the style and of the film, and really getting across that spy aspect. The performances are also really good, especially from Florence Pugh and David Harbour, who give brilliant performances in this movie. Like, I adored them in this film, especially Florence Pugh, who pretty much steals the entire show in this movie. However, in the grand scheme of things, I personally feel like this movie didn't really add much to the wider MCU. It just feels like it's there to kind of fill in a gap, and when you put it into the context of the wider MCU, you don't really feel any better for... You kind of feel the same way you did the movie started. Like, okay, yeah, that was cool, but, you know, it was there, and it just kind of came and went. Then I watched the Amazon original movie Our Friend, directed by Gabriella Copperthwaite, which I thought that name sounded familiar, and then I did a bit of research, and it turns out she is the woman who made Blackfish back in 2013. which is a really, really good documentary if you haven't seen it already. But I went into this film not quite knowing much about it, other than the loose story that it was telling, and obviously the cast. But I was also really intrigued to see what Gabriella could do with a work of fiction. I realised that this is not her first time directing a non-documentary movie, but I was really intrigued to see how that transition between documentary and fiction would work. And this movie really impressed me. Like, on the surface, it really doesn't do anything new in terms of these sorts of stories of someone dealing with cancer and a family kind of coming together to overcome it, those sorts of things. Doesn't really do anything new in that sense. And to be honest, the movie doesn't really need to do anything new in that department, because the way it executes everything is just so tender and heartfelt and very genuine and realistic that it really got me. Like, when I started the film, I was like, yeah, this is going to be pretty good. But by the time the film had finished, I was fully on board emotionally. Like, I was really loving these characters, and especially the character of Dane, played by Jason Segel. Everything about that character kind of hit home a little bit for me, and a lot of the aspects around that character and what he goes through really hit hard. And yeah, this was a really lovely movie that really hits the emotional aspect perfectly without going too far overboard. Yeah, I really like this movie. After that, I then kind of went on a bit of a detour and watched the Blair Witch Project for the first time. Yeah, I really liked it. It's a really simple and effective horror movie that it just works. The low budget really just adds to everything. The performances feel very realistic. The camera work obviously feels very realistic as well, but that's because it's one of the first found footage movies. And I also think watching it on a day when a thunderstorm was literally coming over at the same time kind of added to the eeriness and the creepiness of the whole thing. So that might have had something to do with why I like this movie so much. But yeah, I just really liked the simplicity of this film. It's very good, and I just really liked it. After that, I then kind of backtracked a little bit and went back to Steven Soderbergh with Logan Lucky. This is the first time I'd watched it, because I'd heard some very mixed things about the movie. I'd heard some people saying it was brilliant, and some people saying it just felt like the Ocean's movies with a different type of skin on it. Overall, though, I really had a blast with this movie. It's really funny. It's really well shot. It's very well acted. It's just a very entertaining movie, and that's kind of what I wanted from it. It's nowhere near as good as Ocean's 11 in terms of heist movies done by Steven Soderbergh. But that being said, I wasn't expecting it to be as good as Ocean's. It kind of just feels like it's trying to do its own thing, and it's just having fun with it. And I feel like that's the most important thing to take away from Logan Lucky, is that the movie itself just radiates a fun and entertaining time. The actors look like they're all having fun. The script is hilarious. It's just a very fun movie, and that's all you can really take away from a movie like this. After that, I then finished the Disney Plus show Loki. And all I'm going to say about this is that it's without a doubt the best Disney Plus show that Marvel have put out so far. I thought WandaVision was intriguing to begin with, but then it didn't quite stick the landing. The same kind of goes for Falcon and the Winter Soldier, where it peaked halfway through and then kind of fizzled out into nothing. Loki, on the other hand, is legitimately entertaining and thoroughly engaging from the start to the finish. You have likeable characters, a thoroughly enjoyable atmosphere, and a concept that is very intriguing and is very well executed throughout the whole of the show. It's not one of those concepts where it gets old very quickly. It just works really well. There's also a lot of mystery in this show as well. and it does a really good job of hyping that mystery up the more the show goes on, to the point where it's like, what is this thing? What could this mean? And it does a really good job of keeping that consistency going. And also, the end of the show, without going into too many spoilers, does a really good job of setting up what is to come in the MCU in a way that opens up a lot of possibilities that even I can't fully comprehend at this time. Overall, though, Loki is really good and is probably my favourite MCU Disney Plus show that they've done so far. After Loki, I then watched the new Netflix Italian horror movie, A Classic Horror Story, which I was quite intrigued by. The original trailer that dropped looked very intriguing. I had no idea what the movie was about, but the visuals alone had me intrigued. And the fact that it was also Italian had me very intrigued as well, because I personally haven't seen that much Italian cinema. So, overall, I was very intrigued, but I had no idea what I was getting myself in for. And overall, this movie is a very mixed bag, but for the most part, the more the movie goes on, the worse it kind of got. The cinematography and atmosphere for this movie is perfect. The entire first half of this film just oozes atmosphere, and it gives off the right tone that I was hoping it would give off. It was genuinely creepy, it was gory, and was everything I was expecting it to be. But then the more that the movie goes on, it tries to feel like it's being clever, and it's trying to be the next Cabin in the Woods, but kind of, I don't know, it kind of botches the landing a little bit. Then I finally watched A Quiet Place Part 2 in a cinema, and it is, without a doubt, probably one of the best films I've seen all year. Right, so when it comes to the original, I liked the original. I thought it was a very good proof of concept, and thought it was a very tense and very well made movie. However, there was nothing about the film that made me go, right, tonight I'm going to stick on A Quiet Place. I feel like putting that on again. Nothing made me feel like that. I didn't really have the urge to revisit it that much. A Quiet Place 2, on the other hand, takes everything that worked about the first movie and just kind of dials it up to an extreme in a way that works really well. John Krasinski's direction feels 10 times more confident in this movie than it does in the first. All the performances are fantastic, not just from the kids, but also from Emily Blunt and from Cillian Murphy as well. Everyone is on top form. And overall, I thought the suspense, tension, and the scares were a lot more effective in this film than they were in the first. I mean, this might just be personal preference to me, but I genuinely thought this movie was a lot more suspenseful and a lot scarier than that first movie. Not saying that the first one isn't scary, but this one definitely worked a lot better for me than the first one did. After that, I then watched Butch, Cassidy and the Sundance Kid for the first time, and it's a very enjoyable movie. I can tell why reviewers at the time of this film's release were a bit unsure about it, because it does do a lot of things differently for the Western genre that nowadays would kind of be more well known. But yeah, this was a very fun time, and I definitely think that this movie, one of its strongest points anyway, and I don't think the movie would work nearly as well if it wasn't for the chemistry between Paul Newman and Robert Redford. A lot of the film's humour comes from those two, and I don't think the movie, like I said, I don't think the movie would work nearly as well as it does if it wasn't for their chemistry, because that is definitely the thing that keeps the movie chugging along. Even when the movie gets to a slightly not as interesting part, it's those two that keep that energy and that charisma going. Then, after a lot of intrigue, I watched The Empty Man. I'm not going to say too much about this one because I'm currently working on an Under the Radar episode for this film, but all I'm going to say is that it surprised the hell out of me and that I enjoyed it a lot more than I was expecting to. But that's all I'm going to say. The rest I'm going to leave for my Under the Radar episode, so check that out when it drops, hopefully soon. I'm still in the process of writing it, but yeah, the majority of what I have to say about this film will be in that video. Then I watched this new small British documentary called A Space in Time, which is about these two little kids, one that's 11 and one that's about 9, who have this disease called Duchenne, which basically they were born with, and it over time wastes away their muscles to the point where they just can't function properly anymore. And I mean literally every muscle in their body. And I thought this was a very tender and personal documentary that really highlights that disease very, very well. Because before watching this documentary, I'd kind of heard of it, but not enough to the point where I was like, yeah, I know what that is. But luckily, the documentary highlights it in a way that makes me feel more informed after seeing it. And by highlighting specifically these two kids, really makes it very heartbreaking at points, and also very touching. However, that being said, the movie, for the majority of its runtime, does feel rather one note. You can tell that there are points where they're trying to get an emotional core going, but unfortunately it just kind of keeps repeating the same sort of things and fails to, well, for me anyway, fails to effectively reach that emotional height that it's trying to go for. Then I watched Music, directed by Sia. Again, I don't really want to say too much about this because I am planning to do a video on it soon, but all I can say is that this is hands down the worst film I've seen all year. As someone who is on the autism spectrum, this film just gets so much wrong about not just people on the spectrum, but also how carers are meant to deal with those people. Yeah, this movie was it's just really bad. Even thinking about the film makes, it's just not good. Just don't watch it. After watching the atrocity that was Music, I then tried to cleanse the palate with something different, which is why I watched Blood Red Sky, which, correct me if I'm wrong, but is a co-production between Germany and Britain, and has a very simple concept that you're either going to love and really attach onto, or you're either going to think it's really dumb. Take snakes on a plane, but replace the snakes with vampires. That's the concept. That's the concept of the film. Although take into account, whereas Snakes on a Plane did the concept slightly tongue-in-cheek and did it slightly over the top, Blood Red Sky does the concept in a way that is a slightly more serious and a lot darker. So do take that into account. But for the most part, Blood Red Sky is a lot better than it has any right to be. It's not a perfect film by any means. Like, in the grand scheme of things, this movie is okay. It's decent. But what I got away from the film is that it was genuinely well made. Like, there was a lot of effort that actually went into making this movie. It doesn't necessarily feel as throwaway as you would expect it to be. The movie has some satisfying gore. It's very tense in places. The acting is a lot better than I thought it would be. And overall, it's just generally well made. If you're looking for a fun time, this movie is on Netflix. It's a Netflix original. Give it a watch. Like I said, it's pretty decent. It's nothing particularly amazing, but for what it is pretty well done. After that, I then watched what is probably the best documentary of the year. That is Summer of Soul, or When the Revolution Could Not Be Televised. For those of you that maybe haven't heard of it, it's a documentary that highlights the Harlem Cultural Festival of 1969, which was a music festival purely revolving around black artists of any genre pretty much, that took place in Harlem. However, because it happened the same summer as Woodstock, Woodstock got all the attention and publicity, and this got heavily overshadowed to the point where the festival itself was filmed in its entirety, like all the acts were filmed, but the footage didn't get distributed. And it just sat in a basement for 50 years until this documentary got made and has been fully utilised to its fullest extent. And And I've got to say, this documentary is just absolutely brilliant. It's such a joyous and fascinating experience that perfectly captures the vibrancy of the festival and kind of almost makes me wish I was alive at the time to have actually seen it. It's such an eye-opening documentary as well. Like, just even the fact that the footage was sat in a basement for 50 years and never got shown to anybody, and the fact that this festival, it's almost like the government in America didn't want this thing to exist in the history books. It's like they were specifically trying to go, oh yeah, we remember Woodstock, but this festival, we just kind of forget it happened. But when you see just how important this festival was to the black community of America, but also the acts that were performing and how high profile some of these acts were. Like, you got Sly and the Family Stone, Stevie Wonder, Nina Simone. Like, the list is endless of great acts that performed at this festival, but hardly anyone really knew about it before this documentary was a thing. And I definitely think that's one of the biggest takeaways you can get from this documentary. And then the last film that I watched in July, which I managed to sneak in a showing of yesterday, was James Gunn's The Suicide Squad. Not the 2016 one by David Ayer, the brand new one that is 10 times better than the original. I really enjoyed myself with this movie. I knew this movie was going to be good because, I mean, it's James Gunn. The Guardians of the Galaxy films are a ton of fun and are some of the best MCU films, without a doubt. And I was really interested to see what he would do with the property of Suicide Squad. But not just that, also what he could do with an R rating. Because for those of you that maybe don't know, the films that he made before Guardians of the Galaxy are very, very strongly R rated. Like films like Slither and Super really do push the rating that they've been given. And the Suicide Squad is no different. It really takes that R rating and really pushes it to its extremes. It's incredibly gory, a lot gorier than I was actually kind of expecting it to be, but it's very welcome because I've actually been waiting for a superhero movie of this type to just come along and be balls to the wall insane in every single way. And that leads on to one of my best positives of the film. The movie almost kind of revels in really delving into that absurd, obscure corner of characters in DC's catalogue and really making the most of it. I mean, the movie is just as absurd and insane as some of the characters that it has chosen to pick out of the void of absurd characters. Like, it just really makes the most of it. And for the weird characters that it has in the film, it really does feel like it is taking the weirdness of those people and just kind of translating it perfectly with its visuals. The characters are all genuinely likeable this time around and are very engaging. The violence, like I said, is very gory and harkens back to James Gunn's roots with his films, and the comedy is also pitch perfect. I would say there's maybe one or two jokes that didn't quite land for me in the whole film. Everything else really, really works. And one thing that James Gunn does in this film, and is something that I really do appreciate him for as a director, but here he kind of takes this and really runs with it, is making a scene revolve around such a simple or specific idea, whether it's a certain joke or a certain theme that he wants to just do for a scene that doesn't detract from the story in any way, and he just kind of rolls with it. For example, there is a scene where Peacemaker and Bloodsport are trying to outkill each other with the amount of people that they're killing, and it's such a small little idea that doesn't take up too much runtime, that is just very well executed, is very funny when it happens on screen, and it's just little things like that that really make James Gunn as a director and a writer stand out above a lot of other directors in that genre and in that field. He is willing to take little moments and just kind of run with them, and just knows when to stop them before they get old. So, that is every film that I watched in July. I hope you enjoyed the video. Let me know some films that you watched in July, or your thoughts on the films that I talked about in this video. I'd love to have a discussion in the comments about it. If you like the video, then give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. And I'll see you all in the next one. Bye.